Greetings, my name is David Petrosky. I'm a California attorney and I represent landlords on eviction cases and other landlord-tenant matters in California. Today I'm going to be discussing how to evict a tenant in Los Angeles in 10 steps. First, I'd like to tell you briefly about myself. I'm consistently rated as a 5-star attorney. I've been representing landlords since 2004. I'm a published author and a referral source for many realtors, landlords, and other attorneys. And we get results. Of course, however, there are no guarantees of success in any given case. Let's dive right into it now. Step number 1 on how to evict a tenant in Los Angeles in 10 steps. You're going to want to draft a notice of termination of tenancy. You also need to make sure that the type of notice that you draft is correct. There are many different types of termination notices. There's the 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. There's the 3-day notice to cure or quit. There's the 3-day notice to quit. There's also a 30-day notice to terminate a month-to-month tenancy, as well as a 60-day notice to terminate a month-to-month tenancy. This is just some of the notices of termination that are available to California landlords, and each case is different, so you need to make sure to utilize the correct type of a termination notice. There's also some cases where a landlord wouldn't need to serve any type of termination notices, but those are relatively rare cases. Step number 2, once you've created the notice of termination, the notice needs to be served on the tenant. It's a best practice to use a process server to serve it, and you want to make sure that it's served properly and a proof of service is created by the person who served the notice. Step number 3 is you need to wait to see if the tenant complies with the notice and did what the notice required the tenant to do. Step number 4, you need to ask yourself whether or not the tenant complied with the notice of termination. If they did comply, then there's nothing else for you to do. However, if the tenant has not complied with the notice, you then have to prepare the court documents. And this is called an unlawful detainer, which is essentially the fancy term for an eviction. Step number 5, you need to file the unlawful detainer complaint and other supporting documents at the correct court location, and you're going to determine the correct court location depending on the property premises address where the tenant is renting. Step number 6 is the serving of the unlawful detainer on the tenant, and it must be served via an authorized method of service. The plaintiff cannot serve the unlawful detainer on the tenant. Step number 7 requires the landlord/plaintiff to wait the required number of days to see whether or not the tenant contests the unlawful detainer, and the number of days is going to differ depending on how the tenant has been served. Under step number 8, you're going to ask whether or not the tenant contested the case. If the tenant did contest the case, you need to request a trial or take other appropriate action depending on what the tenant has filed, what responsive pleading has been filed with the court. However, if the tenant did not contest the case, then you'll want to prepare and file documents for a default judgment. A default judgment is a fancy way of saying the tenant hasn't fought and disputed the case, and therefore you're asking for a judgment by default. Step number 9, assuming you as the landlord have won the eviction and you've obtained a judgment for possession of the property, you'll want to then begin the writ of possession and sheriff lockout process. Finally, for step number 10, once the sheriff has scheduled the lockout and notified you of the date and time of the lockout, you'll want to meet the sheriff at the property at the designated date and time. Provide access to the sheriff. The sheriff will remove the tenant from the property if the tenant is still living at the property, and this will be the date when legal possession returns to the landlord. I offer many types of legal assistance for landlords. On my website, attorneydavid.com, there are many forms available for download. I also publish a landlord-tenant blog on the website. More information on this particular blog topic is also on the blog. And I offer free consultation for landlords who are located within our service area and need help with an eviction. Finally, you may want to follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. I do publish a lot of updates and articles that would be of interest to landlords in California. Thank you very much for listening to this video, and I look forward to helping you in the future.